Robert knows a lot more about this topic than me, and I want to hear what he's got to say, and I'm sure you do too. But the Invasive Species Council has been around since 2002. We were formed the year after fire ants were first detected in Australia. So our history is quite closely linked to this issue, and it's something that we have been active around advocating for the control and management and eradication of for the benefit of the Australian community. There's quite a lot of documentation out there about the impacts of fire ants on things like human health and agricultural output and production. But what is often forgotten is that fire ants are also an environmental invasive species. Invasive species are one of the primary drivers of habitat loss and extinction in Australia over the last 200 years. And fire ants are one of the potentially worst examples of that. I often describe them as a triple threat. So many of the issues we work on, escape garden weeds in catchments, hard-hoofed animals in national parks, invasive fish and things like that. These are issues that uniquely affect the environment, but fire ants do have an impact on more than just the environment, our way of life. So it's a very important issue for us. We want to see fire ants removed from Australia as long as that remains technically possible and cost beneficial. And the evidence seems to be that it is still possible and there is still a compelling cost case to do that. This is the second time we've hosted Dr. Robert Puckett in Australia, who insists that we call him Robert. Robert was last here in 2017. And at that time, we were dealing with a fire ant infestation that was around half of the area that it is now. But still, as we're going to hear from Robert shortly, 10 times smaller than the area that fire ants occupied in the United States when they were trying to eradicate them over there in the 1950s and 60s. We have the benefit of the American experience in not being successful at eradicating fire ants. And a lot of our predictions about the impacts that fire ants will have on our country are based on projections, estimates, and those are informed by research, but we have lived experience to draw upon from the United States where effectively they don't have the opportunity over there to eradicate fire ants now, so they've had to find ways to live with them on an ongoing basis. Ongoing baiting, ongoing use of insecticides and treatment, and selecting which land that they preserve and save from fire ants. So Robert's experience, over the years dealing with this issue, his primary area of expertise is in urban invasive insects, I should say, as an entomologist. But it's really good to have him come back, and thank you for coming back again and giving us your thoughts on how we're going and what lies ahead of us if we're going to try and eradicate fire ants, or if we have to learn to live with them as a forever pest in our country. So with that, I'm not going to steal any more of Robert's time or your time for questions.
Just wondered, can you all hear? We have the
We do have microphones. If you can't hear me,
that's
but I'm not the priority. Robert is. So I'll pass it over to Robert now. And
Kitty, go ahead. How are you all?
good.
So I'm Robert, and as Reese mentioned, I work on invasive insect pests in my home country, the United States. I'm actually from Texas. We usually just identify as Texans, you see. And we're an independent-minded people, and we've had issues like this in our state. And of course, we failed our chance to solve red imported fire ants when they came in the 30s of the last century. And I'll talk you through that and kind of sort of the reasons why we failed. Thank you to Gecko, Invasive Species Council, for hosting this meeting, and thank you all for your interest. Have any of you dealt with red imported fire ants on your property so far? Yes, one? Okay, two? Any others? Anyone been stung? No? Reese has been stung. I was stung yesterday. Yep, lived to tell the tale. Yeah, we investigated some property west of here and, well, northwest of here. Anyway, my role here at this meeting, just as it was back in 2017, is to share with Australians what it's like to live with red imported fire ants. ants, which is what we do now in the States, in the southern United States, and I'll show you some range maps momentarily. And I'm third generation dealing with fire ants in the U.S., and my children will be fourth, and their children, and their children, and their children, on and on, because this will be a pervasive pest. In the absence of any new technology with which we can control them that is sort of unforeseen at present, right? And we're always looking. So we spend our time trying to determine how best we can mitigate the impacts of these ants in our system. So this is a red imported fire ant. They're not nearly this large. They're actually a small ant. And it's interesting. I'll tell you about a book that's sort of a historical perspective of fire ants in the United States. And I've heard this sentiment here. When people see them, they expected something larger, right? They expected something the size of one of these Toyota trucks running around or something. They're not a big ant, but they have a very, very disproportionately large impact on the systems in which they invade. And again, I'm just here to share our experience. I'm not trying to guide you in any sort of decision that Australians will make in terms of how you intend to approach this from an eradication standpoint. That's your decision to make. But I just want to share with you what you'll live with if you guys do fail as we did. So I typically start these talks by showing people how to identify ants, whether it's red imported fire ants or not. Where I live, everybody knows how to identify fire ants, right? This is something in everyone's yards and parks and et cetera. But ants are separated into, we refer to them as two-node or single-node ants, depending on the subfamily that they belong to. And the nodes that I'm referring to are here, those two bumps. So this is the gaster abdomen of the fire ant. There's the thorax, and there's the two nodes. And I should have mentioned, I like these talks to actually be talks and be very conversational. So if there's something that I'm moving a little too quickly on, please slow me down, have me back up, we'll work through it. They have 10 segmented antennae. You shouldn't try to count their antennal segments if they're still alive. Make sure that you've killed them first. They have a median clypeal tooth, and so we have other species of Solenopsis ants in our state. As you guys do in Australia, you have Solenopsis geminata. Geminata does not have that structure, so that separates them morphologically from Geminata and Invicta. And then they have conspicuous mounds. Who's seen these? Anyone seen them? Okay, so this is one of the first signs, and in our state, typically if we're educating people on how to identify fire ants, they're folks that have just moved to our state from outside of the range. We don't have a lot of mound building ants. And in fact, I asked, I spent last week at the conference in Gold Coast, meeting with pest managers, and I asked the question, do you guys have a lot of mound building ants? And I heard, yes, we do. Well, there's a list that was recently published. This is a publication. No, these are mounded nest ants. And there's only 2 species there. There's not a check mark next to Invicta, but they mound as well. So that can be a clue that you're looking at red imported fire ants, of course. And also, I love some of the common names of your ants. Common names are usually geographically isolated. They're different as you move around. You guys have some wonderful common names. These are fire ants in a paddock. And actually, these photographs were shared with me a few mornings ago by this man, Stuart Weber. He's very interested in the fire ants on his property, as all of you should be, if you have them. So fire ants have 2 social forms. So some colonies have a single queen, some have multiple queens. And by multiple queens, there could be dozens. And those are, in my experience, more difficult to deal with, especially if you use a granular bait, because you're trying to kill all of the queens that exist there. And if one survives, then you still have a fire ant colony. But there tends to be a different morphology of nests. This is what we historically would, like if I saw this in the field, I would guess that that's a single queen colony. The mounds tend to be much, much larger than the multiple queen colonies. And they're a little bit more territorial. So there's probably a mixed population in this field, although I'm not sure, I'm just guessing. But this looks like home for me. Actually, this is a bit shy of the densities that we live with in our pastures. So they tend to have a poorly developed sense of humor. They do not tolerate being disturbed. And so yesterday I punched into a mound really quickly. I'm usually pretty good at this, but just in that split second, one was capable of grabbing onto this bracelet that I forgot I was wearing when I did it, and she stung me. I don't have much of a welt. I don't really react anymore. in our research in our laboratory, we're stung very frequently, and definitely when we're doing our field research. So here's our story. They came to us along shipping routes from South America, their native range, and actually they were preceded the Invicta was preceded in their invasion by a species known as Solenopsis rictori. Both species came up through the port of Mobile, and then fire ants came in the 30s and 40s and outcompeted the black imported fire ant, along with many other species of ants and insects competing for resources. So you can imagine in any system there's a finite resource budget. These guys end up taking the lion's share of that budget of food resources, and outcompete native species. So yeah, I mentioned they came along shipping routes. They were probably associated with some agricultural products or something like this. They came in and they've done quite well. They've established a range now, and this map is actually a bit dated, but at present we go from sort of western Texas all the way across the southeastern states in the U.S. and up into the northeastern seaboard states, and we've got these disjunct populations out in California, Arizona, and Mexico. And they didn't stop there, right? So they're expanding around the globe. And so this is a nice tidy map, although this also is a bit dated. This was back in 2011. This was some molecular work showing their movement from South America into the U.S. And then they've expanded into Taiwan and China and Australia, and also Japan, South Korea, and most recently in Italy. So they're now in Europe. Yeah, so we learned this last year. So where they show up, they cause significant problems regarding the ecology of the system that they arrive in, the economy of the system, and I'll share with you some staggering numbers in terms of the amount of money that we spend in our country on these every year. And then, of course, just the general quality of life that folks that have to live with these. And so these are some pictures, a couple of which you've already seen, the mounds and the stings. And this is a fire ant stinging. So you'll hear, in our state, it's unusual to hear somebody say they bite you, but occasionally we have to correct people. Actually, they bite and sting. They have to bite. They use their mandibles to gain purchase on you, and then they curl their gaster around. They've got a stinger, like a honeybee almost, but they don't leave their stinger behind. They can sting multiple times. And they'll do this to soft-bodied insects and hard-bodied insects alike, and kill them for food as well. This is a ground nesting bird. So our ground nesting bird populations are in peril in our state. So we used to have a thriving population of bobwhite quail. We don't have those anymore. We still have our wild turkeys, but they have a much thicker eggshell, so the fire ants have difficulty getting in. But they will kill birds and other invertebrate animals as well. Cow-calf operations, we have a lot of cattle operation, as you know, in Texas, and calves are very susceptible. If a calf gets dropped in the near vicinity of a fire ant colony, it can be curtains, and other wildlife as well. So they've actually threatened one of our key species. We celebrate a lot of different animals in our state, and we have decided that we have a horned lizard. It's a species of lizard that is our state reptile. And fire ants outcompete their main food resource, which is a red ant in the genus Pogonomyrmex. And so as the red ants have gone, so have the horned lizards, because they don't have their food resources. But more importantly, we do lose people. This is a high school football player, Corpus Christi, Texas. This was back in 2013. And so he was involved in a tackle. The school district, so our school districts have to maintain athletic grounds free of fire ants, or they're supposed to. Somebody missed one. He and a teammate fell into a mound. One guy was fine. He didn't make it. This is a woman in Georgia, and it's not as though we walk around worrying that we're going to die from red imported fire ants, but we do lose people. This is a woman in Georgia who stepped on a colony and was attacked. And then my son is he's a competitive skeet shooter, also a high schooler. He's 16, and so in his club, one of his teammates, this boy's father, was allergic to insect venom, to insect stings, and so he would tell us where his EpiPen was in his vehicle. We also carried one on his body, but in the event that he became incapacitated, we would know where to get an EpiPen. And last spring, he was buried. After becoming stung by an insect. Now, we don't know that it was a red imported fire ant, but it was during a time of the year where temperatures were kind of cool in the air, so I would imagine a lot of insects flying around. But he did have a sting on the lower extremity of his body. And he passed. I suppose much less important than loss of human life is loss of monetary resources to these ants. So this is a paper that was published back in 2002. A man named Curtis Lard, Dr. Curtis Lard, he's at our university, Texas A&M University. He was an agricultural economist, and he wanted to kind of get his arms around how much Texans were spending on this problem. But then he even moved that forward and ran a survey of the southern United States, southeastern United States, to determine how much money people were spending. Anyway, when you add all this up, we were at about somewhere around $5.5 billion annually. And if you push that forward to today's dollars, which I did on the ride over, that's getting close to $9 billion annually in the southern United States. And we will spend that money forever. And those are costs associated with treatment. So we don't have a federal program or a state program that treats fire ants for us. We do it all on our own. So we go to the store and buy our baits. Hopefully, folks get educated on the baits that they're buying, the toxins that they're buying, the potential hazards associated with them, and that they apply them at the proper label rate and application rate. That, like I joked with Reese the other day, my father, he hates fire ants, as do most of us in the southern United States. My father likes it to look like it snowed on the ground after he's baited, with all the corn grit granule on the grass. You don't have to do this. The application rate is 1 pound or 1.5 pounds per acre. And so, just for example, have you seen these granular fire ant baits? It's a corn grit carrier matrix. So is that pretty close to a square meter? At the right angle of a square, somewhere in the neighborhood. How many individual granules, if you apply granular baits properly, at the proper application rate, would you imagine? And I do this all the time with our pest control guys in Texas, because they're sort of like my father, they overuse baits. Sometimes you overuse baits. How many individual granules would you imagine you would find in this square meter? How many? Guess. 11. That wasn't a setup. 11 granules. That's how little bait is required to destroy plots of fire ants where we work. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Sir, did I hear a question?
Nope.
Okay, so this is the book that I mentioned. This is like, I've joked since I've been here because I just read it for the first time on the plane, but I've quoted from this book for years as though I've read it, I know it front to back. People do this. Silent Spring is another example of this. People my age and younger, most of us have not read it, but we will quote from it as though we have sometimes. But anyway, I read this book. And I've said, as I've talked about this in country, I felt like people on the plane probably thought I was losing my mind because I was so animated when I would hit sections, because this is actually a dissertation that this man got published. This is a dissertation. He was a student at University of Pennsylvania. And he went back and studied the history of our missteps along the road to allowing fire ants to escape into the U.S. So, as I mentioned before, fire ants arrived in the 30s. And began to spread. And it wasn't until the 40s, actually a little bit later in the 40s, that we had time to deal with them. We were involved in a World War in 2 different theaters at the time. But after that concluded, we had all of that machinery that came back from the 2 theaters, including planes, right? And we also had very sophisticated chemistry science at the time, right? So, if you got a lot of planes and you got a pretty good sense of how to build insecticides from your knowledge of chemistry, and that's your hammer, all the world looks like the nail, right? And so it was decided that we would try to eradicate our fire ant populations. And I want to read this excerpt to you. I know I shouldn't read to you as a presenter, but it's important, I think. This is starting at the quotations here, and this is referring to the PPC, and this was a plant pest division of the United States Department of Agriculture. It's long disbanded. USDA is still in place, but anyway, there is one basic principle which would be essential for eradication. The state would have to be in a position to require that treatments would have to be made to every square foot of ground needing treatment. The plan would have to be mandatory rather than voluntary in order to succeed. Coordination with the state plant boards gave the USDA authority to spray land without the owner's permission. But the law mandated that the USDA could only pay for half of the program. State and local communities had to pay the other half. Thus, even those without fire ant problems had to pay for the eradication campaign and the USDA needed to convince them of the program's necessity to maintain funding. Sound familiar? Okay, so going on. Uncle Sam is ready to use a fleet of 60 planes to go to war against the dreaded fire ant. Only the modern airplane dropping insecticides on 20 million acres in the critical area can hope to stop the menace. The department's entomologists plan to establish a quarantine around the ant's perimeter to prevent it from escaping the south, right, the southern U.S. going north, then pattern bomb from the periphery inward. Concluding with a mop-up operation to hunt down and kill any stragglers. This was, in essence, the fire ant wars. And if all went well, in 20 years and at the cost of $100 million, the USDA would have sprayed an insecticide onto 20 million acres and eradicated the pest. So you imagine, I understand your eradication program. And this just, I was reading the war plan for your eradication program, with one exception. So this is basically what was being described in that excerpt. Okay, so what's the difference between what we do? Does anybody know this story?
Yep.
What's the difference? What did we do that you guys are not doing?
Don't really see much difference at the moment, but
I'll show you.
enlighten us.
The chemical use.
Ah, that's right, yes.
Do you know heptachlor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an organochlorine. This is a contact insecticide. So this is an indiscriminate insecticide that will kill every insect that comes in contact. Well, almost every insect that will come in contact with it.
Not much difference, really.
Do you think they missed some of the fire ant colonies when they dropped heptachlor from the air? They did. And when those ants swarmed the next year, they pushed out their reproductive swarmers, they made it on the wing, and they landed in the promised land. There were no competitors. And that's when we lost. Right then. Because we chose to use a contact insecticide. That actually has downstream impacts on not only other insects, but vertebrates as well. This is a very dangerous insecticide.
Different name.
All right. So this is our situation at present. And what I do want to point out, so people have shared with me some screen grabs of folks that have said some things that weren't all that inviting about me coming here and saying, well, this guy can't even solve these in his own state. Understand, this war was surrendered about 8 years into my life. So if that person thinks that I should have been out there before primary school leading the charge, whatever. So now we just try to clear them from our yards and clear them from playgrounds or whatever. And also what's really important to note here is that this is, aside from, of course, this is a problem, and we feel for these folks in the western United States, but this is largely a southeastern United States phenomenon. And so these ants have expanded to the territory that will support them. They can't survive. This is a subtropical animal. They can't survive up here like in Minnesota or something in the Midwest. So if we tried to start an eradication program and the government went to the other states and said, look, can we push in on this? These guys would laugh them back to Washington, right? And they'd be like, that's their problem down there. There's a giant difference between our country and yours. This is the habitat suitability modeling of the territory that your fire ants can likely expand to, which is basically most of your country. This is not our publication. This is from you guys. So it's a bit of a different story here.
Pretty cold.
So it looks as though the habitat at least would support them across maybe 90% of your country. And of course, you guys all live on the coastlines. They're going to be quite well there. So what do we do about them? I'll kind of share this with you. I get loads of calls all the time about people who do not want to use insecticides, and there is an answer, but this is not like an eradication answer. This is like if you have an organic garden in your backyard, I can tell you how to kill that colony that you can see, right? And it's fairly simple. You just boil water and you can boil them, and boiling water will kill them. This is very labor intensive, and if you had 15 mounds in your yard, it might take you the weekend to do this work. This is not how you will control fire ants. This is how you can kill a mound in your yard. And also, so this is the underground nest architecture of fire ants. So they built sort of this conical nest underground, and it protrudes over the top if it's a mature colony. We'll get back to that in a minute. It's very important. And then they have lateral foraging tunnels, and they'll pop up several, a meter or a few meters away from the colony and go out foraging and then return with food. So you can actually remove these physically. This is a small colony, a young colony. But we just cut in with a shovel and cut around them, and then you can dump the whole colony into a bucket if you've lined the interior of the bucket with talcum powder.
Oh, that's what I tell.
And you got a few days. They'll continue to try to climb out, and every time they do, they'll peel off a little bit more of the powder, and eventually they'll find an avenue out. And we've had to teach our students when they go to do this, there can't be any like living plants inside. And they use shoots of grass that grow up. It'll create a bridge, and they'll climb out. So anyway, we do this routinely. A couple times a year, we'll go out and bring in 20 or so colonies of fire ants for laboratory research. And we have to separate them from the soil. Have you seen the rafting fire ant photographs? Okay, so they'll do this in a bucket as well. We put them under, we've got several deep sinks built into our laboratory. We'll start a slow drip in the morning, and then by the afternoon, the water level will have risen over the sediment. And then we can just scoop them out with a spatula and put them into the
So when you're putting the nest into the bucket, is the nest on the ground still viable?
If you leave queens behind, you will still have a viable colony on the ground. So what we typically do, you'll do that operation I just showed you. Go to the next mound, maybe 2 or 3, and then you circle back because you've got ants that are out foraging and they're coming back in along those lateral tubes. And then also you can often have these little chambers where queens might not be directly under the surface of the mound, but you got to get all of those. And you'll leave behind some workers for sure. Yes, ma'am.
So you just said before about having mounds have got more than one queen. So it's the smaller mounds. Did you say they've got more than one queen, or that's just what you're
It's
assuming?
a very good question, and this is something I've been asked by several people, like when we were out sampling yesterday. The question was, if you've got a small mound, is that a multiple queen mound? Well, the reality is you don't know yet. Because a mature mound at some point is a small mound, right? So that big mature monogyne single queen colony that I showed you, at one point it was this big.
Yeah.
So you can't rely on that.
So my other question then is, what data have you got that tells you that that's a single queen or a double queen or whatever? Like, how do you determine that? Do you forest through and find the?
No.
So how do you know?
We never do that work. Now, sometimes once we've separated that big throng of ants from the water, often you'll find many queens, but nobody does this except for laboratory researchers. There's a genetic test. We look for a specific gene. The combination of gene in the queens is big B, little b, or versus big B, big B, and then little b is terminal, so we don't see those.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a genetic test.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do that in the laboratory. And sometimes we need to know that for our research. Some of the pesticide manufacturers have started, our Environmental Protection Agency has sort of built this investigation into our trials in the field. I don't fully understand why, because the manufacturers don't bring an insecticide to market for a single queen versus a multiple queen colony, so who cares? You know?
Yeah.
And it works on both of them.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Okay. Thank you.
Then, I'm sorry, was that?
No, thank you. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So that was sort of how we physically remove them or physically destroy them. But the reality is most people where we live treat them with baits. And if we're going to use an insecticide, I'm a big, regardless of whatever species you're talking about. If there's a bait that's been marketed, that's been shown to work on that insect, I would start with the bait first. Because they're usually designed to avoid non-target impacts. So like cockroach baits, for instance, German cockroach baits. You've ever seen the baiting systems that have like a small opening, right? So that disallows other larger insects from taking the cockroach bait. So anyway, if you can get an insect, in this case an ant, to eat a toxic bait, then it's better than spraying a contact insecticide around the lawn, right?
Can I ask? So there have been companies who've produced bait called Ant Go, for example, which is specifically targeted for the fire ant. So why is the Australian Fire Ant Eradication Program not using something that's directly designed and targeted for a fire ant?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. It's Ant Go?
Yeah.
Ant Go? I don't know that bait. And
I do have. Huh?
Can you tell us about it?
It's been designed specifically for fire ants.
But I mean physically.
And the crazy yellow ant.
Oh, so is it a liquid bait?
I don't know. I do have the material safety data sheet.
Okay, great. I'm happy to take a look at it. I don't know that bait. That's not in our market, or if it is, I'm unaware of it.
That's what I was being the information I've been getting. So I just from a pest control company. So I'm just confused why the Australian National Fire and Eradication Program doesn't use something that's been designed specifically for the fire ant, and why they're not actually then killing the fire ant.
But then you ask the question, who said it's designed specifically for fire ants? Is it the company that made it that's saying it's specifically designed, and the company will say anything to get you to buy it?
Well, it's more
Potentially, I don't work for a company.
Possibly Marnie from the Invasive Species
You guys
Council
talk.
can answer some of that.
Yeah.
At the end, we have a Q&A, and we
Okay,
can go
beautiful.
into that in a bit more detail.
okay.
grabbing something from my bag. I'll
This is a bit of a prop, but it'll be important momentarily. Yeah, it's hard to answer that question. So companies manufacture products, and in our country, I can't speak for Australia. So in our country, the companies will come to third-party testing facilities, laboratories around the United States, and say, "We'd like you to trial this bait," or whatever it is, whatever product. And we just tell them whether or not it worked in the field. That's it. Yeah, it's the manufacturers who make the marketing claims about their products. Now, that's why I asked if you knew more, what you knew about that bait, because it was a corn granule matrix with a soybean oil to which a toxicant has been added. Then that's like how we do fire ant control in the United States, and really the rest of the world. Do you see? So if it were that way, I would say, well, yeah, it's been built to sort of mimic what we do in our system that we know works very well.
So with soybean oil,
Mm-hmm.
it's highly flammable. Putting it over forests, and then when we do backburns in Australia, doesn't that become an accelerant then?
I could imagine if you had a large concentration, it would. Like a depot or something. But if it's been applied at, again, 11 tiny granules.
What if it's not calibrated? And
I can't speak to that. I mean, there's a
we're just
label rating,
asking
there's
because
directions.
nobody's giving us answers to these questions.
I couldn't answer that question either. I've not heard that.
So most of our bushland is aerial baited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
Right.
I don't imagine we're going to get 11
Granules.
granules per square meter with aerial bait.
Yeah, that's a concern.
Which then causes problems for koalas.
Well, surely those that are at work at this are aware of this, right? This
No.
concern?
They might be, but
I'm not
they're doing
sure.
anything about it.
Okay.
Do we have
So I'm
concern?
learning. I've been at a conference all week. I'm learning from you as you guys are learning from me.
We've got a lot of catching up to do.
Okay, so not all ants are attracted to the same baits. I'll blast through this really quickly. Some ants like protein baits. So like your sweet baits, your liquid baits, and this is where identification is very critical. In my world, people know ants. They know how to identify them.
Sorry, does your areas, like, do you actually, well, I mean, I know they know it because you've got fire ants everywhere, but do they do a proper, what am I trying to say, education on teaching people what they are? Like if someone moves into your suburb area, whatever, are they educated on that, or are they just educated really, really, really quickly
Do
because they
just
get
what we're
bitten?
doing now,
Okay.
Yes.
Just a quick one. I mean, I think what you showed before about the description of a fire, I thought that was excellent.
Yeah.
I've seen what our program is doing, and I'm sorry, it's pretty pathetic. They say almost everything's a fire ant. You can't tell. They're all different sizes and shapes. Not one thing that publication that they sent to everybody ever went to that detail. That's
That
pretty
was-
sad, because they're basically almost telling people that everything's a fire ant or could be, and it's quite obvious. There's a very distinct thing that they look like, and that's not being done properly, which means people are also scaremongering and think everything's a fire ant, but it's not. And I think that's a major problem. That's really poor on our government and how we've put through this program. It's not acceptable.
I expected some of this.
Yeah.
Have you seen some of those documentations?
Some of the what?
Some of the publications that our fire program sent out?
I
It's
have.
pretty bad.
Yeah.
It's propaganda. It's wrong. It's not factual.
Yeah.
This is-
So right. So I'm halfway around the world for my family for 3 weeks. And I'm going to tour around this country starting yesterday. and I'm not being compensated for this. I can go grab my bag and include all my receipts that I'm going to use my university account to pay me back for all the food I'm buying. I've been accused online of working for Syngenta. Syngenta. You know Syngenta, they manufacture Advion fire ant bait. An excellent fire ant bait, by the way, but I don't work with
And
them.
so what's the chemical in that one?
Syngenta?
Yeah.
Oh, so Advion is indoxacarb. I'm going to show you a slide.
Okay,
But
sorry.
I do want
Sorry,
to put that
thank you.
discussion to bed right now before I give
Yep.
my talk at the Pest Management Conference.
Yeah.
The leader of Syngenta in Australia came by my table and gave me this pair of tube socks. So I did take a little bit of shilling. So listen, what was it? I was accused of as being a shill for the pesticide manufacturing industry in your country.
Oh.
Trying to sell baits for the eradication program. I hope you guys attempt an eradication program for on your behalf, right? Because that's going to be costly over the short run, and it may fail, but if it does, just as I showed you, you're going to spend billions of dollars into perpetuity on these ants. Do you understand? Do you understand the failed logic and whoever posted that online? If I'm shilling for anything, it's that you spend a little money now so that you don't have your grandkids aren't spending it, right? That's where the big money is. If I was shilling for them, I would be telling you, don't do anything. Let it go. Get used to it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's my message. So people know how to do this in our state, although this is a terrible way to do this work, putting baits directly on top of mounds. That's not how we do this work, because remember, they've got the lateral tunnels that come out where they go foraging. They don't care about what's on top of their mound. The man that I showed you earlier, Stuart, shared with me a video of magpies picking up baits around a colony, so he's putting directly on top and then just scoring the colony. Well, that may work, but you know, he's going to get that mound in his paddock, but it's not going to do anything for the overall control of the population. So these are the two industry standards by which, like, if a company comes to us and says, hey, we'd like you to run a trial on our new bait, in most cases, they've got a budget that will allow them to do replicated plots. Usually we're like 100 meters by 100 meters. We count all the ants inside, make an application at a pound or a pound and a half per acre, depending on the product. And then we come back, all the students from the lab, and we count those colonies over time to see the reaction to the insecticidal bait. If their company wants an industry standard included in the trial, they always ask for one of these. This one you can buy at all the big box stores. This is one that most folks keep around their homes. Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I know most of the people that I know keep a bag of Amdro in their house for ants that pop up. This takes 6 or 8 weeks to kill the queen. It's a nerve toxin and a growth regulator. This is a straight nerve toxin, indoxacarb. This is Advion, but this is a 3-day kill, right? So about 72 hours, the whole colony is destroyed. So I actually treated a yard. My sister-in-law has a special needs child at their house, and she has seizures, and so they can't have fire ant mounds in their yard. So I treated their yard the weekend before I left, before last weekend, and then went and checked things on the Thursday before I left, and they were dead. Yeah, so this is an excellent product for clearing your yard from fire ants.
Is that applicable, these chemicals, when actually fire ants' nests have been seen?
Pardon?
So do you apply these chemicals when you're actually aware that there's fire ants?
Yes, I would never recommend to like a homeowner or a property owner to apply fire ant baits if they don't know fire ants to be there. There's one catch. This will be tricky in your system, except, you know, outside of the eradication zone. But hear this message, because I've heard this confused by your countrymen several times since I've been here, landowners and people managing different projects and this and sort of thing. The idea is that, quite naturally, you would look across the landscape and go, well, there's a mound, there's one over there, there's one back there. We're going to go deliver baits or a contact insecticide to those. People are injecting with different we don't do that. We don't inject colonies with contact insecticides. But the problem is, at one time, all those colonies were started by a queen, right? And she went to the air, mated, landed, started laying eggs underground, and eventually laid, you know, there may be 300,000 individual worker ants in that colony. But at one time, there were a few thousand. And so they didn't require all that complicated nest architecture underneath the ground. It didn't have to deposit soil on top, so you wouldn't see those. The problem is, in the infested areas, they are there too, right? So if you only attempt to manage the colonies that you can see, you're spinning your wheels, right? This is why we broadcast, because we kill not only the ones we see, but also the individual colonies that are developing and are young, that are inconspicuous in the environment. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't.
How, Jenny?
So how far an area, if you've got a mound if you've got a yard that's got a couple of mounds in them, how far an area around that?
Would you treat? Most folks in our part of the world just treat the yard, wall to wall.
But I'm saying in how far would you say that they would spread from that
Area.
If this was the house,
spreading out to forage.
yeah. So how far around that?
Yeah.
Like,
so,
do you suspect? Like, would it go through? Like, if it's a suburb and you've got homes everywhere and creeks and forest and all of that sort of stuff around that. Like, how far around that would that
All of
be?
this information is available online.
No,
I'm
it's
asking
not.
you,
No, it's not.
Sorry, sir. I'm just asking.
I'll be happy to.
Sorry,
I'll be happy
I'll
to
just
We
shut
should
up.
perhaps finish this question, and
Yeah.
Robert, if I'm sure
we
you'd like
closing
to
in on-
get through your presentation,
Yeah.
because we're going to have lots of time for Q&A at the end.
Okay, so this is out at Cedar Grove. This is a man. I think I understand your question. So if this is the colony,
Thank you.
Correct.
right?
Yes.
You got foraging. I can't help myself. You got
Thank
foraging
you.
ants that are going out and foraging during
Yeah.
the daytime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They find food. Are you asking how far those foragers go?
Yeah, well, yeah. Like, how far away is that kind of? Do they go
Could that impact
kilometers or do they
No,
go
no, meters. 20 meters or so.
Okay.
No, not
Okay.
all
But if the
far.
winged queens have
Thanks.
already hatched and flown, they can fly 7-8 kilometres, okay?
Depending on the
So
wind.
that's
And
what will happen.
yesterday-
And one queen will set up a new nest 8 kilometres away.
Correct. This is
right?
correct.
So
And this
that's
is happening-
why they're out in Tallabudra Valley now, right? People are crying because they're broadcast spraying like
Like the pointer?
distributing this thing, right? But the things are turning up with nests that no one knew were there.
Yeah,
So it's
so-
a damn good job they're doing by broadcast
Well, let's hold
spreading
tight.
this
Let's hold
stuff
tight.
out.
Let's hold tight. Let's not argue. Let's not argue. I understand your passion. I understand that you guys are
There's a lot of
frustrated.
crazy people that we have to battle
Excuse
out
me,
there.
do not insinuate somebody's mental health here. Thank you.
It's okay.
That's not
Here,
acceptable.
I understand your question.
Thank
I
you.
understand
Thank
your
you.
question.
You did
You're
answer
asking
me.
if somebody's
Yeah.
got a colony in their yard, could you
Correct.
get stung over in your yard?
Correct.
Absolutely. But worse, we were out yesterday, we saw tons of colonies that had reproductive swarmers, right? So the queen lays inseminated eggs that become reproductive swarmers.
Yeah.
They leave.
Yeah.
And they mate and they start a
Yeah.
new colony elsewhere. That's what this man was referring to.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got a colony in your yard, but those swarmers might go downrange many kilometers, depending on the wind, if they get swept up by the wind, and now they're setting up downwind from wherever this colony was when they pushed out. And they will do this a couple of days after a rainfall event when the temperature's warm, like now,
Yeah.
right, in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And they were
Yeah.
doing it yesterday
Yeah.
out at Cedar Grove where we were. Anyway, I'm gonna yield.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if they become entrenched in your country, I suspect it will be forever. And they're very difficult to manage. And you can expect all of our problems, and probably some that we don't have in our country, and some that are unforeseen by me. This is not fear mongering. We know this to be the case.
Sorry, Robert, a few slides back you had the Rocky Point sugarcane farm on.
Yes.
Just there.
Yes. I'm sorry, Stuart.
Yeah.
Where we were yesterday in the morning.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I imagine that area is very quite infested with them, is it all?
So as we would walk down the margins of these paddocks, we would hit a mound about every meter or so, sometimes more. Yeah. Yeah. So yesterday was a really tough day for me. This wasn't the case when I was here last time in 17. When I left, I thought, in good shape, got a good plan. Let's get after it.
So what went wrong?
I don't know. Again, I've just been in the field in this room. I don't know. And I don't know anything's gone wrong, right? Because as I understand the plan, there's an eradication zone on the outer boundary that receives treatment across the entirety of the eradication zone. Then you've got the containment zone on the interior. Well, if this works, the treatment zone will make its way to the interior. You're shaking your head.
Because it's already busted that. It's already outside of that.
So this was sort of, so this is a problem too, because humans are going to move materials.
Correct.
And this
And
is
this
the
is-
biggest part.
Correct.
You are going to, and this is going to take,
Primary issue
Yeah.
in the spread
Correct.
of the
you
fire ants.
can't move. See, we have a quarantine in place. You get a citation if you move them across our boundary.
The ants go further on truck and cars then by flying.
But that's just
right,
isolated
well-
cases though, right?
I think that's right, and they've
That's
been.
not the entire band spreading, like,
No.
70 cases.
No, that's a
That's
colony
just
that's on some
one
agricultural
colony.
products that gets offloaded outside of the known zone.
So it's not really like breaking the zone.
Well,
It's
Not as an
It's
expansive
like an
front. I think she's
outlet.
right.
It's not the whole band moving.
Yeah, I think
No,
that's right.
it's definitely not the
I
whole
think that's
thing.
right. But unfortunately, that was the part that I was sort of naive to. I thought, you know, from what I understand and have learned from Australians my last trip, everybody kind of gets on board, but clearly somebody hasn't. They've carried some
And pushing
colonies.
the
elsewhere.
band further doesn't help either.
Pushing it inward.
Outward.
Yeah.
They have to keep on modifying the band to be outward because the last one has been breached. So now we're going to create a new one. It's further away.
I don't know that would. How far away are those new
Or you
infestations?
can check
Oh,
with the National
several
Environment
hours.
Program.
So, then that's a new
Yeah.
infestation. You just build a band around that and whack those
Yeah.
down. You're at the whack-a-mole period of this program, and hopefully you can do it well. Yeah. So anyway, that's up to you
Anyway,
guys.
sorry.
But I'll
Keep
be
going.
watching from afar, and I'm available. I mean, my contact information is here if you'd
Can
like to
you?
reach
Yes,
out.
please.
Lewis, I think you need to get hold of that.
Anyway, we haven't finished today's program. As I mentioned,